this court.
On the afternoon of February 23, 2022, in a quiet suburban neighborhood of Kansas City, Missouri, an unimaginable horror unfolded behind the closed doors of a modest two-story home on Maple Street. Melissa Rycroft, a beloved 32-year-old elementary school teacher, and her two daughters, 7-year-old Faith and 4-year-old Sarah, were found brutally stabbed to death in what prosecutors would later describe as one of the most savage crime scenes they had ever witnessed. The responding officers, hardened by years on the force, struggled to maintain their composure as they documented the bloody aftermath: multiple stab wounds on each victim, defensive wounds on Melissa's arms and hands, indicating she had fought desperately to protect herself and possibly her children. The most shocking aspect of this heinous crime wasn't just its brutality, but the identity of the person who would eventually be charged: 78-year-old Cameron Bailey, the grandmother of the two young victims and mother-in-law to Melissa. Before we dive deeper into this chilling case, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. If you're enjoying this true crime analysis, please consider subscribing to support our in-depth investigations into cases like this one. The story of Cameron Bailey would become one of the most disturbing examples of family violence in Missouri's recent history, challenging perceptions about elderly perpetrators and exposing the dangerous undercurrents that can flow beneath seemingly normal family dynamics. Detective Mason Mitchell, who had been with the Kansas City Police Department for 15 years, arrived at the scene at 5:10 p.m., responding to what dispatch had described as a multiple homicide reported by a family member. His body camera footage, which would later become crucial evidence in court, captured his initial conversation with Cameron Bailey, who sat wrapped in a shock blanket on the front porch, her hands trembling as she sipped from a paper cup of water provided by paramedics. "I just came by to drop off some cookies I baked for the girls," Cameron told Detective Mitchell, her voice surprisingly steady despite the circumstances, her eyes not meeting his as she spoke. "I knocked, but no one answered, so I used my key. Derek always wanted me to have access in case of emergencies, and when I walked in, I found them. I found them like that." The detective's training immediately triggered subtle alarms. The elderly woman's affect seemed incongruent with someone who had just discovered her family brutally murdered, her clinical description lacking the emotional devastation such a discovery would typically elicit. Neighbors had already gathered behind the police tape, whispering among themselves, several mentioning to officers that Cameron and Melissa had a strained relationship, with one neighbor, Janet Collins, stating she had overheard heated arguments between the two women on multiple occasions. As crime scene technicians processed the house, Detective Mitchell received a call from his partner who had been canvassing the neighborhood, discovering that the home directly across the street had a doorbell camera with a clear view of the Mitchell residence. The footage would become the cornerstone of the prosecution's case. It clearly showed Cameron Bailey arriving at the house at 4:05 p.m., 10 minutes before Melissa returned home with her daughters, and contradicted Cameron's statement that she had discovered the bodies when arriving at 4:50 p.m. When confronted with this discrepancy later that evening at the police station, Cameron's demeanor changed dramatically. The trembling, shocked grandmother was replaced by a defensive, argumentative woman who claimed the camera must be wrong, that she had been at the grocery store until just before calling 911. Her alibi quickly fell apart when store security footage showed her leaving the supermarket at 3:30 p.m., giving her ample time to reach the Mitchell home by the timestamp on the doorbell camera. The investigation gained momentum as detectives uncovered the volatile family dynamics that had been building for months. Derek Mitchell, 34, Cameron's son and Melissa's husband, was working at a construction site when the murders occurred, his alibi confirmed by dozens of co-workers and his foreman. When notified about the deaths of his wife and daughters, Derek collapsed at the work site, requiring medical attention before detectives could interview him. His devastation appeared genuine to investigators, who initially considered him a potential suspect, until his alibi proved unshakable. Text messages recovered from Melissa's phone painted a troubling picture. She had been planning to leave Derek, had consulted with a divorce attorney, and was in the process of seeking a restraining order that would have included Cameron Bailey. The medical examiner's preliminary report indicated the murders likely occurred between 4:20 p.m. and 4:40 p.m., with Melissa suffering 27 stab wounds, Faith receiving 15, and little Sarah enduring 12. The report noted that the attack on Melissa appeared to have been frenzied and personal, with several wounds to her face and neck indicating overkill, a term used when the violence exceeds what is necessary to cause death. Blood spatter analysis suggested the attack began in the kitchen, where Melissa was preparing an after-school snack for the girls, with evidence that she had attempted to flee toward the back door before being overcome. The girls were found in the living room, with Faith's body positioned in a way that suggested she had been trying to protect her younger sister, a detail that would later bring jurors to tears when presented in court. Kansas City police arrested Cameron Bailey on February 25, 2022, charging her with 3 counts of first-degree murder. The arrest shocked the community, with news outlets running headlines questioning how a grandmother could perpetrate such violence against her own family. Prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty, citing the particularly heinous nature of the crimes and the vulnerability of the child victims. Cameron's court-appointed attorney, Douglas Howard, immediately began constructing a defense based on his client's age and lack of physical strength, arguing it would have been impossible for a 78-year-old woman to overpower a 32-year-old and 2 children, even with the element of surprise. Public interest in the case exploded as details emerged about Cameron's background. She had been a respected bank manager before retirement, was active in her church, and had no prior criminal record. Friends expressed disbelief, describing her as a devoted grandmother who baked cookies for her granddaughters and attended their school events faithfully. Yet former colleagues painted a different picture, describing Cameron as controlling and manipulative, someone who held grudges and could be vindictive when crossed. One former bank employee told reporters, "She was sweet as pie until you got on her bad side. Then she could make your life miserable in ways that were hard to prove or complain about, always operating just under the radar." As the case moved toward trial, the prosecution built their case around the security camera footage, physical evidence found at the scene, and the powerful motive, Cameron's determination to prevent Melissa from taking her granddaughters away through divorce. The knife used in the attack was discovered in a storm drain 2 blocks from the Mitchell home, with Cameron's fingerprints and DNA on the handle, and traces of all 3 victims' blood on the blade. Cell phone records showed that Cameron had made several calls to Derek in the weeks leading up to the murders, with notably longer calls following Melissa's meetings with her divorce attorney, suggesting Derek may have confided in his mother about the impending separation. Community vigils for Melissa and her daughters drew hundreds of participants, with Melissa's colleagues from Marshall Elementary School establishing a scholarship fund in the family's name. Faith's classmates created a memorial garden at their school, planting perennials that would bloom each spring in remembrance. The case became a lightning rod for discussions about family violence and the often overlooked potential for elder perpetrators, challenging stereotypes about who could commit violent crimes. As the trial date approached, national media descended on Kansas City, with Court TV announcing plans for gavel-to-gavel coverage of what was being called the grandmother murder trial. The Kansas City courthouse stood stoic against the gray February sky as pre-trial hearings for the state of Missouri versus Cameron Bailey commenced exactly 1 year after the murders. Courthouse security implemented heightened measures, anticipating the emotional intensity the proceedings would bring to a community still reeling from the brutal killings. Inside courtroom 4B, Judge Eleanor Winters presided with a firm hand, her reputation for running efficient, by-the-book proceedings making her well-suited for a case that promised intense media scrutiny and public emotion. The prosecution team, led by veteran prosecutor Sarah Richardson, arrived with 12 boxes of evidence and a clear strategy focused on the security camera footage that would become the linchpin of their case against the elderly defendant. Defense attorney Douglas Howard entered alongside his client, Cameron Bailey, who shuffled into court using a walker, a recent development that many observers suspected was a tactical decision to emphasize her frailty to potential jurors. The state intends to prove beyond reasonable doubt that the defendant, despite her age and grandmotherly appearance, methodically planned and executed the murders of Melissa Rycroft and her two young daughters, Faith and Sarah Mitchell. Richardson stated during the hearing on admissible evidence, her voice steady as she outlined the prosecution's approach. "We will demonstrate that not only did Mrs. Bailey have the means and opportunity to commit these crimes, but she had a powerful motive, preventing her daughter-in-law from divorcing her son and obtaining a restraining order that would have limited Mrs. Bailey's access to her granddaughters." The courtroom remained silent as Richardson continued, describing how the state would present evidence of increasing hostility between Cameron and Melissa in the months leading up to the murders, including witness testimony